And then let's move on to Rishi. So Rishi is a completely different sort of kettle of fish, if you like. His kind of manifesto is rebuild the economy, and that's obviously because he is a former chancellor. Keep Brexit safe. So in other words, he is still very much for maintaining Brexit, not trying to reverse it. And I mean, the interesting thing is that Liz was originally she voted against Brexit, so she's a Remainer traditionally, and beats Starmer's Labour. So in other words, he's thinking about the next election, and I think, but the poll suggested that he was probably the best candidate to win in the next election in terms of if it came down to him and Liz Truss. So that's sort of interesting. He's playing to his strengths here. And as I say, you can see from this picture that he's quite well. He obviously works out and is sort of very trim and slim. He did spend time in California, so I think he is sort of aware of the whole kind of health and fitness thing, and I think he's kind of emphasizing that with all the green. And he does have this moniker of Dishy Rishi, so he is kind of known for being quite sort of good looking and not at all smarmy, but I think he does exude a certain degree of kind of health and well-being, which I think does appeal to a certain demographic, if you like. I think particularly millennials. So I think that's interesting. So he says, I'm standing to be the leader of the Conservative Party and the Prime Minister of our country. Britain's potential is limitless. I'm firmly committed to ensuring our country is the best place to live, work and have a family. I have a proven track record of showing serious leadership in tough situations, saving millions of jobs during the pandemic, providing the largest increase in defence spending since the Cold War, and fully funding the recent Rwanda resettlement programme. Together we can rebuild the economy, keep Britain safe, Brexit safe, and beat Starmer's Labour. So I think he's again trying to sort of appeal to the sort of the middle of the party, but slightly to the right, but also being seen as sort of young and dynamic. I think he is trying to sort of say, Britain's potential is limitless. I want to sort of help young people get ahead. I want to help people get ahead generally. So he's very much about that sort of that ideal of self-improvement and that kind of thing. And he is a living example of that. He came from a sort of a upper middle class family, but he went to a good school, Winchester School in Hampshire, and kind of went on to sort of to go to Oxford and that kind of thing. But he was certainly the first person in his family to do that. So in that sense, I think he is he's an aspirational figure for a lot of Britons, and in that sense, I think he is sort of playing to his strengths. So that's kind of interesting. But let's look at his chart. Now this is again, I've rectified the chart based on my best guess of what his rising sign is likely to be, and so I've set it for 7 o'clock in the morning on the 12th of May 1980. We don't know his birth time, but this is my best guess, and I'm kind of basing it on it's a kind of an intuitive sense of his character, but also it's got Venus in the first house, and he does have this kind of nickname of Dishy Rishi, and I think this fits quite nicely with the idea of somebody who is charming and pleasant and good looking, but not necessarily in a smarmy way. It's quite a sort of a light way, and I think he's got a bit of a he's got a pleasant kind of disposition, and a lot of people like him. The likability score is quite high for Rishi, so I think that this Venus in the first house would fit. With his Taurus stuff, you can see he's got a stem of Taurus stuff, the Sun, Mercury, the part of Fortune, and Chiron in the 12th house, and I think that also fits quite well. That the Sun is rising, but the ascendant is still in Gemini, and you do get the sense with Rishi that he is, although he's got Sun Taurus, he doesn't come across as being a sort of like a strongly earthy Taurus. He does come across as being, he's got that kind of lightness of touch that I think could be down to sort of a strong Mercury or Gemini rising, something like that. Something to just kind of lighten the load. And then I also like Neptune being across the way on his descendant, because there is something very kind about Rishi, and he does kind of come across as somebody who's very kind of open and enthusiastic, and to me there's something of like the sort of the Labrador puppy about him, and I think that could be this Neptune that which is sort of usually very friendly, very generous, very enthusiastic, and sometimes doesn't have good boundaries. So, but is very service oriented, and so I kind of like that for the ascendant, where you've got the sun and on one side Mercury on the other. And I think, it's important to sort of say that, he does natally have a sun Neptune opposition, or well, I mean, it's not really an opposition because Neptune's in Sagittarius and the sun is still in Taurus. So no, it's not an opposition. It is a quincunx. So it's still a little bit of an uncomfortable aspect, that I do think that one of the things that stops him from shining is the fact that other people may take advantage of his good nature. And so, he's probably had to over the years learn to adapt, or to sort of adjust that Neptune so that he does have better boundaries, so that that he isn't such a sort of a target for people who are, what's the word? Who may not necessarily have the best motives, put it that way. But then, as I say, he does potentially have Venus in the first house, and he does have quite a lot of positive Venus aspects. That Venus is sextile to Mars and Jupiter. He's got a Mars-Jupiter conjunction. You can see down here in Virgo, and he does come across as being, as I say, quite healthy and fit. And that would fit with somebody who's got sort of like Sun Jupiter in Virgo. Virgo is a sign that loves health, and Mars likes to keep fit and to sort of do exercise. And then you've got the Jupiter aspect, which is the sort of the feel-good aspect. So I do think that for Rishi, that there's a strong, one of the things that kind of keeps him on the level and makes him function very well and handle stress is probably the fact that he does a lot of exercise. I think you can tell that he does do a lot of exercise. And then, sextile to Venus, I think that again is part of his appeal, that he does have this wholesome, healthy, quite sort of energetic and positive, like upbeat kind of disposition. And I think that probably would appeal a lot to young people. So I'd imagine that within the Conservative Party, there are probably a lot of members that are up and coming that would support him. But of course the problem with the Conservative Party is that it is generally, the power base still resides with the sort of the pale male, the sort of older pale male. And so in that respect, I don't know whether he's going to sort of get the edge at this point. But I think the key thing with Rishi is to sort of say that he is very ambitious. He's he's also someone who's a hard worker, and anyone who's got a lot of Virgo in their chart, which he does, he's got Saturn in Virgo, and Jupiter as well, and Mars, is going to be a hard worker. This is someone who's really, really good with detail, who doesn't mind rolling up the sleeves and doing the hard graft, who's very modest, and I think that, we can definitely say that about him. But it doesn't mean that he's not ambitious. If you've got a Mars-Jupiter conjunction, you are quite an ambitious person. So I would not underestimate him. But I think he's the type of person that's going to get there, perhaps by kind of hitching his star to somebody else who's maybe a little bit more powerful than him, I suppose in much the same way as he kind of came to prominence through being the Chancellor to Boris, in the sense that he was a good foil to Boris. He never stood on Boris's toes, but he kind of did, he did a really good job of being Chancellor at a time when the country needed somebody really competent and at the same time was not afraid to take risks and to be a little bit bold, in terms of coming up with the like the COVID grants and that kind of thing. So I think that's probably his route to power, is not necessarily directly, but similar to kind of, I don't want to compare him to Gordon Brown, because I don't think he's at all like Gordon Brown. Gordon Brown's quite a serious person. But I think Gordon might also be a Taurus, or have strong Taurus in his chart. But in that sense, his sun in Taurus I think is good, because it does make him a good money man. It makes him, he's a steady hand on the tiller, and I think even if he doesn't win the leadership race, I think he could well end up back in the position of Chancellor, and that might be a step up for him. That might be his next step, kind of up to power. But certainly, I think in terms of polling, he did the best, I think, at the beginning of the race, as far as being the best candidate to help the Tories win an election. So it depends on what the Tories are kind of looking for in terms of a candidate. Are they just looking for somebody to sort of fill in until they can find somebody that they feel will win them the next election? Or are they looking more long term? Are they? I mean, are they looking for somebody that they think will kind of go the distance type of thing? I think that's the big question. But definitely, if you've got Mars-Jupiter conjunction, you are very dynamic. And as I say, this is someone who's really, really good with detail. You definitely want someone like Rishi on your team because he's not going to let you down. He's not going to drop the ball. He's going to stay on message. And he's also going to be very sharp. He's going to come up with some really interesting facts and details that maybe other people might miss. So in that sense, I think he's very diligent and definitely a sort of a doer. And then he's also got Moon in Aries, which, again, some people might find surprising because Moon in Aries does tend to be, someone who's quite passionate. And, he doesn't kind of come across that way. But then, that Moon is also trying to Neptune. So that can sort of, I think, dampen down any potential selfishness, because Moon in Aries can be a little bit sort of me. So I think that, again, that Neptune helping to kind of soften any edges. And, if he did have a temper when he was younger, I think that the Neptune would have helped him to sort of build up like tolerance and sort of like empathy for people around him, so that it would become more good-natured. It would sort of dilute that energy a little bit because, Moon in Aries can be, as I say, a little bit not volatile. Although, I think it is important to point out that he does have his Sun and Mercury opposite Uranus. So this is not somebody that one should underestimate. Uranus in Scorpio is quite it's that surprise sting in the tail, and the sting in the tail that can come out of nowhere. And just to kind of have that opposite his Sun Mercury, I think, he probably is very good-natured and tolerant and sort of easygoing most of the time. But I think if you push his buttons too far and he snaps, I think people can probably be quite shocked at his kind of reaction. So I'd be interested to see Rishi under stress. That might be a tell, for how that Uranus kind of works, because if the houses are correct, then it would put Uranus in his sixth house, and obviously that's the house of work and the house of health. So if he's under stress on some level, like whether he's either ill or working too hard, it's possible that Uranus might show itself. And also I think the other thing to bear in mind is that that Uranus would also rule his midheaven, and so I think, again, people underestimate him at their peril, and I think it's something that we'll see when we look at his human design, that it's also kind of built into his human design as far as his leadership abilities and things are concerned. I think this is someone who ultimately is going to take a lot of people by surprise long term. I don't know whether he's going to win this particular race, but I don't necessarily think that. I think it's sort of a case of like the hare and the tortoise. That even if he doesn't win this particular race, that I think long term he's someone to watch out for, to look out for, to sort of to keep your eye on. So here we move to the bi-wheel, and again we've got the Tory party chart in this sort of the inner chart, and then we've got his chart transposed on that. And again, there's a lot of synastry here. It's quite interesting. Both candidates have a lot of synastry with this 1912 chart. So the first thing, of course, that we notice is that he's got Jupiter and Mars rising in Virgo, and this is conjunct the Tory party ascendant. So this is very, very promising. I think that definitely he's a doer, he's a go-getter, and I think his enthusiasm and his general sort of like joie de vivre and kind of he exudes so much positive energy that I think this will definitely appeal to the Tory party. They like the fact that he's someone who likes to get ahead, who's aspirational, who wants to sort of do well for himself, and this is kind of espousing the more sort of like the aspirational side of the Tory party, if you like. He also has his nose across the ascendant-descendant axis of the Tory chart. So that again is quite significant. It does point to the Tory party as being a great catalyst for him. It's that the two, entities are kind of destined to sort of like play an important role in history together. That through the Tory party, he could really make a name for himself. And, it's interesting that he's got the North Node in Leo. So it may be part of his sort of his life lesson, or the reason that he's here is to learn to sort of like shine his light brightly and not apologize for being successful, or that kind of thing. And, he has had a lot of detractors that have tried to sort of like pull him down and sort of like brief against him and that kind of thing. So, it's possible that this is part of his soul lesson for this particular lifetime. But, I think it's really interesting, as I say, that he does have this really interesting synastry with the Tory chart. The other thing is that he's got his Sun-Mercury conjunct the Sun-Saturn conjunction here on the midheaven. Again, very, very positive. Sun on the midheaven usually points to a leader in the ascendancy, somebody who's got a bright future, somebody who is a natural leader, and to have that kind of synastry with this Tory Sun-Saturn conjunction, I think points to the fact that the leadership certainly have plans for him, long term, that they think that he's definitely someone that can take them far, that can take the party far. It just may not necessarily be that his time is now. I think that's the key thing, is whether the timing is 100% right. And then the other thing that is interesting is that his moon is conjunct the North Node of the Tory party chart. So again, interesting, that Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak have this this affiliation, this kind of synastry with the Tory North Node. So again, both obviously playing an important role in the destiny of the party. And to have the moon here, I think, is interesting. It does point to some element of the feminine aspect somehow being involved. Whether this is him supporting Liz Truss, because I think that he is a candidate, or he's a politician that would work really well with women. I don't see him as being somebody who's going to be sexist or sort of stuck up or refuse to sort of work with women. I think he's quite modern in that sense, and this could be where he could really help the Tory party to sort of improve their diversity, in especially since we've had so many resignations of women MPs in recent years due to a lot of harassment and like hate from from trolls and that kind of thing. So that's an interesting one. It would be interesting to see, if he did get into power, how many women would be in his cabinet. I would think the number would be quite high. So that's kind of interesting. And then he also has some harmonious aspect patterns in terms of his Saturn. It's in a minor grand trine with the Tory Mars and Sun Saturn conjunction. So we've got the Sun Saturn here, and then we've got where's the Tory Mars here with Neptune. So I think it's interesting that he's got a lot of positive aspect patterns, in relation to the Tory party chart, more so than Liz does. She's got quite a lot of squares and that kind of thing, if you look at the overall kind of aspect patterns. So I think he would have an easy ride to the top, but then he is a male, and he is good with sort of figures and the economy and that kind of thing, and that's always a kind of a winning combination for the Tory party, because they are seen as the party of people who kind of keep a handle on the budget, don't let things, don't spend too much, etc., etc. Although, I mean, under Boris Johnson, I think the national debt went up considerably. I think it was a very large percentage of GDP that got spent on grants, but then that was exceptional circumstances. So, I don't think that, he has said a number of times that we have to be realistic in terms of the budget, and that we do need to try and balance the books. But of course, it's all about, extraordinary times require extraordinary measures, and sometimes you have to sort of like push the boat out a little bit. And I think, that's why he kind of did what he did. I mean, I think it's interesting too that he's got Pluto on the south node of the Tory party. So, and this is in the third house. So Saturn in the second, which is a great, as I say, for balancing the books and for being a good treasurer, that kind of thing. I think he's definitely seen as a steady hand on the tiller, and that might be exactly what the UK needs right now, given, the cost of living crisis and, the fact that things are expected to get really much worse for people in the autumn and the winter with inflation, especially with energy prices. So, it may be that Conservative members decide to vote for him, in that respect, especially given that, Liz Truss she's not being really big on detail when it comes to her economic policy, whereas he's a kind of a tried and tested, a known entity when it comes to, the Treasury. So that's an interesting one. I mean, it might also be that they decide that he would be a better treasurer, that he would be better going back into the position of Chancellor. So that could kind of go either way for him, I think. But as I say, going back to this Pluto on the South Node, I do think that that this is potentially problematic. I think that this is where he's a little bit weak, is in terms of like communication. That a lot of people feel that he doesn't have a lot of charisma, and he's sort of lacking that sort of gravitas at the moment that I think is required for the role of Prime Minister. Although, I mean, I think after Boris, it's hard not to seem like you have some gravitas. But I think if you compare him to Liz, she does seem to be a little bit more serious, and she has had more experience in senior posts in government. So, that might count against Rishi in this particular instance. So, and it could also be, as I say, that this is people. It could be backbiting. It could be, as I say, people counter briefing against him, that kind of thing. Because Pluto can sometimes attract scheming and people sort of trying to undermine you, that sort of thing. So yeah, it's an interesting one. And then he also has his Neptune is also trying to the Tory party Mercury North Node combination, so that again is really positive, and I do see that Neptune is actually ultimately working in his favour, that Neptune on the descendant that he's got, that he is seen as someone who really wants to sort of like serve and kind of and is quite selfless in terms of his dedication to the job, and I think that would really count in his favour, with the Tories, in terms of work ethic and that kind of thing. And I think it's also interesting that the nodal axes in both instances are in harmony. So again, there's this sense of destiny when it comes to Rishi and the Tory party, that I do think that they have a long relationship ahead of them. And as I say, even if he doesn't make it into the final vote this time, I don't think we should sort of rule him out as being Prime Minister in the future. That's kind of my feeling. But let's move on to his human design, because that's where I think things get really interesting. So here is Rishi's human design body graph, and what's interesting about him is that he's a 3-6 generator, but he does have a lot of centers switched on, including his will center and his throat center. So that's kind of unusual for a generator, because generators usually have the sacral center switched on, but they don't always have access to the throat. And I think it's interesting that he is split definition in the sense that he's got the third eye and the throat connected, but it is not then connected up to other parts of his chart. So it's almost like these two parts to him. The one part that is very brainy and is a good problem solver and is quite sort of cerebral on the one hand, and then there's the part of him that I think is quite soft and emotional and is kind of full of health on the other. And I think in terms of the two things, that it makes him a good package, but somehow the two things don't kind of join up. And I think being a generator, if you say compare power in terms of power and charisma, that Liz Truss certainly wins out in terms of who's more powerful of the two people. But as I say, we should not underestimate him, because he does have the will center switched on. And what's so fascinating is that it's switched on via the 2551. And 51, hexagram 51, is the hexagram known as shock. And remember what I was saying about that Uranus in Scorpio that he's got, that he's not somebody to be underestimated, that I really do think he could take a lot of people by surprise, and that ultimately, the fact that he's got that will center switched on, I think points to the fact that he will end up in leadership positions long term. It just might not necessarily be it won't be in the sort of traditional way of like smiting your enemies and being very sort of alpha male, put it that way. I think this is Rishi is somebody who could, to me, represents the sort of the more like the new male, in that I think he's probably very good, that he gets on very well with women. He's not threatened by women. That he doesn't have a huge ego, and ultimately, as I say, I do feel with him that he wants to make a difference, and that he wants to sort of be of service. And I think that ultimately it's those kind of values that are going to win out long term with the younger generation of voters. So I do think he has a very bright future ahead of him. Now, he does, and the other thing, of course, is that he's got the moon in gate 51. So again, that feminine energy that I was talking about, with his Aries moon making a conjunction to the Tory party North Node, but also, in his own chart trining to Neptune. So I do think that there's a kind of a softness about him, but again, not somebody to be underestimated. And I think will win out through kind of soft power, or just sort of, one of those people who wins through hard work and likability rather than being a sort of a gangster, if you like. And, I also feel with him that there's a sort of a youthfulness about him, and I think that might be attributed to the fact that he is a 3-6 generator. So 3-6s, generally speaking, have kind of 3 phases in their lives. So they start off experimenting and sort of like trying things and then failing, and I think you can see that in terms of his career. He started out, doing all the right things. He, as I say, he went to a good school. He went on to Oxford University. He then went to a job in the city, and then he moved to California to sort of manage a number of hedge funds. But, he made some mistakes along the way. There's that whole thing about, him having a green card, and him having a green card, and his wife being a non-dom, and kind of innocent mistakes that I don't think that he thought will kind of count against him. He didn't do anything illegal, but it certainly was frowned upon, by certain kind of members of the establishment. And, so in that sense, and again, him sort of being in the city and stuff until I think he went into politics when he was about 35 or 37, something like that. So it kind of fits with this idea that the 3-6 experiments up to the age of 28, then from 28 until around about 50 or so, they tend to then learn from others, to sort of sit back and sort of learn from the mistakes of others. So they first kind of knock their heads and make mistakes themselves, then they learn from the mistakes of others by kind of observing, being around people maybe who make gaffes and that kind of thing. And then normally when they get to around about age 50 or so, they move into their 6 energy, which is about coming off the roof, as it's known in human design. So this is when you become a role model or a leader. So as I say, I do think that with Rishi, he's got to play the long game. I think for him it's going to be a case potentially of being the tortoise, not the hare, and that he might have to sort of gradually work his way up by being in supportive roles to other people who are in positions of power, being a foil to other people. And that, whether it's by the time he gets to his Chiron return at around about age 50, this is when he could really potentially come into his own. So I think, it's kind of a long game for him. But as I say, it's interesting that he has both the throat and the will senses activated, and that he can lead through sort of oratory with the 2551. This particular channel is interestingly associated with innocence and unconditional love. So as I say, there is something very innocent about him. There is something to me of the kind of puppy about him in terms of his looks, and his kind of, there's something very open about him. But also, as I say, that this 2551 is associated with shock. So I think, people will probably think that he's a bit of a pushover with all that kind of niceness, that sort of Venus in Gemini energy, only to find that he is actually very competitive, and that they shouldn't sort of underestimate him. It could also be, of course, that that other women are competitive with him, and that he does have this slightly strange dynamic with women that want to kind of try and dominate him. So that's something that I think we need to kind of watch. Particularly if, for example, Liz does get in and she sort of appoints him to her cabinet. It'd be interesting to see how that kind of relationship works. And then, interestingly, like Liz, he's also got emotional authority. So wisdom, again, for him, coming through, cycling through the entire emotional wave before acting. So this is, again, someone who shouldn't make rush decisions, who needs to really sort of sleep on things and wait for the emotional wave to break before they commit to anything. And someone who's quite heart-led, which I think we do see with that strong Neptune and the moon Neptune's trine. So I think that fits quite nicely, that this is someone who's got a lot of empathy and compassion for other people, and again I think, you know, has gone into politics for those kind of humanitarian reasons, if you like. But then on the other side, he does have this 2343 channel, which connects the throat up to the third eye, the Artemis center, and this is known as the channel of structuring. So it's very cerebral. This is someone who's very logical, and who is good at connecting logic with the throat. So in other words, they can work through or understand concepts, and they can then explain them to others in a very sort of simple and clear way. And I think this is probably where he's really, really good, is that he can take sort of like technical information, break it down for people very easily, and, you know, can sort of number crunch no problem. And I would imagine probably did really well at school and university. But I think sometimes the key thing with this particular combination is that these are people who must wait to be asked for information. So they're very often the sort of the brain boxes who kind of work behind the scenes, do all the number crunching, but then they need to be in that meeting and then wait for the boss to address them before they speak. That's how the energy tends to work. You know, this throat center is not connected up to the will center, so he doesn't have to be invited to speak or give his opinion. And I think that is essentially the problem in terms of the energetic dynamics that sort of stop him from having that charisma, that stop him from being able to kind of blaze a trail, or sort of to initiate, to make changes. He needs to sort of be asked, you know, and in that sense tends to play a supporting role. But as I say, I don't think we should underestimate Rishi. I do think he's got a bright future ahead of him, and that he just needs to sort of play the long game. So yeah, I hope you found that interesting. Of course, you know, it'll be fascinating to see what happens on the 5th. But if you are interested in looking at some of my previous political blogs, do check out my Astro Insights blog, which you can find at blog.astrologysphere.com.